Welcome to SilviCast, a podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge,
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
and we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your host for today's show. Hey, Brad.
Bonjour, Gregor.
Hey, this week I was reminded of something, the lug nut story.
Yeah, the lug nut story.
Yeah, that one.
That's we're going to talk about that.
Well, yeah, because, Brad, part of being a good silviculturist is making mistakes, but then learning from those mistakes, right?
Yeah, but there's also a part about, putting up a curtain you don't necessarily want others to see all the time. But I guess we can let everybody behind the curtain. That'll work.
They already know what's behind the curtain with us, Brad. So too late for that one.
It might be a sheer curtain, but it's still a curtain.
And I have a point dragging up the lug nut incident. So here it is. We both like bird hunting. I think people know that.
Yep.
And every year we take a trip out to the Dakotas to go pheasant hunting. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have to take your beater minivan.
Yeah. Wait. You can't diss the van, Greg, because that van has gotten us out of some pretty I don't know, we've taken that van places that you probably shouldn't take minivans, right? Like, do you remember going across that cornfield in that was in South Dakota, but
Yeah.
I remember thinking this is not a great idea, but hey, when in Rome kind of stuff.
That van has been places it shouldn't have been.
Yeah, it's not a beater, it's a classic.
It's a beater.
Yeah.
So one fall, we're on our way in the beater van to Ashley, North Dakota, and we hear this big, and all of a sudden the van starts to vibrate.
Yeah, but Greg, in my defense, we slowed down, right? Like, your vehicle doesn't make thunking noises now and then?
Like, Brad, what was that?
Yeah.
Until a little ways down the road, and then another. And now the van's vibrating really bad.
Yeah, and being safety conscious, Greg, knowing that I know where all of the safeties are on the van. I pulled over and basically where were we? We were
I think by that time we were in Ellendale.
Yep.
So what did you find, Brad, when we pulled over?
Well, we did find on one of our tires that we did not have 5 lug nuts on. I think we were missing some. Let's just put it that way.
I think we were down to 3 at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of a necessary component for a vehicle, wouldn't you say? Okay, that's a yes.
Yes. Well, okay, hold up.
But I think you said what you always say. Oh, it's all good. 3 lug nuts is plenty. So we tightened what we had left, and we're on the road again. And I swear, 5 miles outside of Ellendale, there it goes again. Our 3rd lug nut bit the dust. Meanwhile, while we're driving, I'm Googling, how many lug nuts can you drive on? And all I get are these warnings. If you're missing a lug nut, please stop immediately.
Well,
and I'm like, well, we're not missing a lug nut. We're missing 3 at this point.
Yeah. Greg, if you're going to trust the internet and what it tells you about how to live your life, then I think, you just got to work with that. But to fill out the story, though, we took it nice and easy. We made it all the way into Ashley, North Dakota, no problems. And a shout out to, remember Brad's service? We got in, we actually they ordered it right away. We were hunting the next day.
Yeah.
And so there was a problem, but it worked out in the end. Life was good.
We learned something from that incident, though, didn't we?
Well, yeah, we did. Well, I did. So remember that you always have to put your lug nuts on with as much torque as necessary to keep them in place for a long period of time, because about 2 weeks earlier, we were grouse hunting and I had a flat and we were on soft ground and I don't think I had that tire high. I thought I had it up and I think we just didn't have those lug nuts on tight enough.
I think it was you and my brother who put that tire back on. So I'm going to blame it on both of you.
Yeah, well,
but no, that's not, I guess that is a lesson. But the other lesson that just like lugs on a wheel, Brad, we learn that sometimes things are better in clusters.
So So we pull back the curtain for just to create this bad segue into our conversation today.
Ta-da!
I get it. I get it. I get it.
Because today on SilviCast, we'll be talking about cluster planting, or a method of reforestation developed long ago in Russia and Europe that establishes trees by planting them in small functional groups.
And we could have spared everyone that story and just announced that today we'll be talking with Dr. Somidh Saha from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Karlsruhe, Germany. And I think anyone who's planted oak seedlings before is going to really want to listen to this episode.
Fasten your lug nuts.
This season of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the SilviCast world go round, so thank you. Dr. Somidh Saha, welcome to SilviCast. Before we begin, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, which is really cool, and what you do.
Thank you very much for having me in this nice show. And I am Somidh Saha. I was born in India, studied tropical forestry in India, and then switched to temperate silviculture and temperate forestry, and studied forestry in University Freiburg. And at the moment, I am located in Karlsruhe, which is a city on the Rhine River in southwest Germany.
Okay. And southwest, so is that, if I'm picturing my mind, I didn't, Greg, were you on the European option at Stevens Point?
I did go to Europe. Yes.
You did. Yeah. So,
Yes.
Okay. So I wasn't as rich as you. So I was at Tree Haven and suffered, but you were there. So, but I'm picturing it maybe like, is it close to France?
Yep. France is just, say, 40 minutes from here.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the other side of the River Rhine. So we are on the east bank of the River Rhine. And in the west bank, we have a state called Rhineland-Palatinate. And just a little bit southwest to that is France, the province Alsace.
Okay.
And Somidh, what do you do in your current position?
So I am working as a research group leader at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and I lead a group of 10 to 12 people at the moment. If I also consider bachelor student and master student, then around 20 person.
Mm.
And my research focus is actually restoration forestry. So how to restore forest after disturbance. And those forests could be near city, like peri-urban forest, and also can be a commercial forest or plantations. Although I have a lot of research activity in Germany, I still have research projects in tropical countries like India and Ghana. And in addition to restoration forestry, another research focus for me is urban forestry. For example, how to manage trees in the city. So I am working, you can say, in between arboriculture and silviculture. And that's very fantastic because for me, as an ecologist also, it's a very interesting question. What happens when a tree grows in the forest in a natural setting? And what happens with the same species when it grows in a human landscape, solitary inside the city? So I have many projects where we have a gradient from city to peri-urban area.
That's really interesting. You don't often see folks that work in both sides here. Usually they're either urban or they're, more traditional silviculture, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's right, Greg. We do draw a really distinct line, at least here in the United States, that, two different societies. In fact, Society of American Foresters has urban, but urban forestry has its own International Society of Arboriculture. So those worlds don't really collide very often here.
Yes, here actually the urban forestry is not in a format like we have in US, for example. So urban forestry is very, very underdeveloped in Germany. It's more, so city tree management has been seen more from a horticulture point of view, rather from, say, ecological and forestry point of view. So in US, you have very good distinction and also cooperation within US Forest Service for urban forestry and traditional forestry. But I come from traditional forestry to urban forestry because when I was a student in Uni Freiburg, we had no lecture on urban forestry at all. So this whole urban forestry is taught as a horticulture in applied universities, very little in the traditional German universities. So that's why I can say that in our state of Baden-Württemberg, which is a federal state in Germany, in southwest Germany, we are the first one who started research on urban forestry from a perspective of arboriculture, forest management, ecology, rather than only, aesthetic values of trees or traditional horticultural values. So that is something interesting here. Yes.
What brought you to us, Somidh, is something from your past, going back to your PhDs.
I think I don't know, Greg, we came across your some work that you had done, I think through one of our listeners who actually contacted us and said, "Hey, do you know about this concept of cluster planting?" Which is fairly new. I had to look that up, and I know, Greg, we've talked about in other situations, this idea of applied nucleation
Yes.
as a way to kind of talk about planting trees. But maybe we could start with, since we're going to be talking about tree planting, what does, in a more traditional sense, tree planting look like in Germany today?
Yeah, I think before I come to this tree planting and cluster planting, I would like to give some brief overview about the forestry in Germany, very, very, very briefly.
Oh, sure.
So Germany is a very small country when I compare to US. So the size is only, say, 357,000 kilometers square. So you can say it's 2 times size of Wisconsin. That's the size of Germany. Yeah. And the forest is 114,000 kilometers square, which is around 32% of countries under forest cover. Yeah. However, if we compare this with production, you will see that Germany produced 76 million cubic meter of roundwood per year, and United States produce in an average 182 million cubic meter of roundwood. So Germany, although a very tiny country compared to USA, it produced nearly 50% of annual production of log or roundwood in comparison to USA. So I always try to say first that we have an intensive forestry here, and perhaps in North America, we have an extensive forestry. So this intensification of forestry is somehow related to cluster planting. So cluster planting was perhaps developed as a result of this intensification also. Otherwise, cluster planting would not be a meaningful option if you don't have a need for intensification. So that is a little bit the background. And yeah, I think we have around 48% of forest in Germany which are owned by private owner, 32% by the state, and 20% by the community. And current growing stock is 3.7 billion cubic meter. So an annual growing stock is around 300 cubic meter per hectare, and so which is quite well stocked in a forestry point of view. And timber increment is 11 cubic meter per year per hectare. So that's the annual increment for the whole country. Of course, in my area, the increment is around 14. To go near Berlin, their increment is much lower because it's less productive area. So around 5 to 6 cubic meter per year per hectare. Monoculture dominates still. 24% of country's forest is under monoculture. And it's very interesting, perhaps for the viewers from USA, because spruce and pine trees, so Norway spruce and Scots pine, these two tree species alone constitute 52% of Germany's forest. And beech tree, Fagus sylvatica, European beech tree, they constitute around 20% of Germany's forest. And oak trees, that was my PhD, Corucus robur and Corucus pitrea, they constitute 10% of Germany's forest, and rest is 18%. So you can see that spruce, pine, beech, oak, these 4 species constitutes 82% of Germany's forest. So you can imagine now the vulnerability. What happens if some of these species die off? And that is exactly what we see. We see a large-scale forest dieback at the moment in Germany. Around 70% of standing trees in this whole country is somehow impacted by drought, diseases, fire. So 70 to 75% of trees are kind of, injured or unhealthy. Yeah, so We have intensive forestry compared to extensive forestry in North America. And when you think about financially, 190 billion euro was the output of German forestry sector in 2018, which is 5.5% of total GDP. It's not so much, but it's still quite a high number. And 1.1 million people, which is 0.01% of total population of around 87 million now in Germany. So out of 87 million people, 1.1 million depends on forestry sector, so which is also a quite large number. So this is a bit the overview. And if you want, I can now start a little bit about how cluster planting came to the scene.
It's kind of interesting. And I like that idea of thinking about things as intensive versus extensive. And so maybe just a little bit. So I would imagine with intensive, that really means that you probably rely more on tree planting as opposed to us, where maybe it's a little more on natural regeneration, at least in the eastern United States.
Very true. So I told you that 10% of Germany's forest is oak forest. And out of that 10% land of total forest land, 50% of Germany's oak forests are young forest. So young means age less than 40 years. And all young oak forest, out of total young oak forest, 50% are regenerated naturally. So we have 50% natural regenerated oak forest, and we also have a 50% planted trees. Yeah, you are right. Intensive also means that single tree selection silviculture. So we have single tree marking. So this, what can I say? Like we call it high value silviculture. So trees for making high value per tree.
Mm-hmm.
The foresters actually know every single trees of their stock, and they try to mark it early on from the stand development so that it becomes a crop tree. So we have an idea of potential future crop tree. So potential future crop tree means that when broadleaf forests like oak forests are very young, we go and we mark them 200 to 300 potential future crop trees needed when the stand is around 20 years old, so that after 120 years, so the felling cycle for oak is 140 years in an average. So in our side, maybe 120 years. In central Germany could be 150 years. Then we have the maturity. Maturity means the target DBH of an oak forest should be 80 centimeter. Branch-free bole length should be 25% of the tree height. So the average tree height would be around 30 meter, 25 meters. So the branch-free bole length should be around 10 meter, 8 meter. And that means this intensive forestry only works when you have a value and a market for that, right? For example, where do all these high quality oak log goes here? They mostly go for veneer production and wine and whiskey barrel production. The French winemakers and the Italian and Spanish winemakers, they actually give a lot of money when we are auctioning the high quality oak logs. And so this is a very old market. If these two demand decline, then we also have a decline of this early crop selection, early quality selections of oak trees. Yes.
That's really interesting in terms of that really sets the frame, I think, for why cluster planting and those intensive practices have come to be in Europe. That is a lot different than here, as you said, where we're just more reliant on natural regen. We do not intensively manage to that level on the tree level like that. So maybe this is a good time to talk about like kind of what that tree planting looks like. I think, Brad, you asked sort of what does it look like traditionally, and then what does it look like with the cluster planting?
Yeah, so I would like to repeat a little bit about why cluster planting came to the scene again. History of cluster planting you can trace to two countries. Russia, Imperial Russia, 1911, before the October Revolution, and Scotland. So in 1911, the first cluster planting came in Tula and Voronezh region and Donbas River Basin, where the war is going on at the moment. And the idea was that they also had the issue of time and money and labor. So they wanted to promote natural regeneration. Russian foresters, Ogijewski, he was one of the first detected that when wild boars, he called wild boars as the farmer of the forest, wild boars actually do their job, then the acorns get accumulated in small spots, and you can find oaks as a clump structure naturally in the forest. Yeah. Then he came up with the idea of nest planting. So this is a type of cluster planting where you, in 1 by 1 meter, very small patch, you put a lot of oak acorns and you try to get a thicket from the early on, and you put such nests around 200 per hectare, spaced between 7 to 8 meter. And your expectation is from one of those thicket where you have around, say, 20 to 50 oak seedlings growing, at least one will be qualified as a future tree, or one will at least go qualify after 20 years, at the pole stage. So because after the First World War and Second World War, there was a huge amount of taiga and landscape, and Eastern European landscape got damaged, and they need to be, kind of restored. And then nest planting actually worked, and it became a cheap option for the Soviet administration to promote. And it also became an option for shelter belt planting, because you know that in Eastern Europe, you have a lot of issue with wind, and you need to protect your crop from the advancing wind. And for the shelter belt, also nest planting was very successful. On the other hand, in Scotland, there was another problem. The problem was actually how to develop oak with Sitka spruce. So Sitka spruce was already getting introduced in Great Britain in early 20th century. Yeah, and then Professor Emil Anderson, he was a professor of silviculture of Edinburgh University. He came up with an idea called spaced group planting. So spaced group planting is you plant instead of high density like Ogijewski did. He made an initial growing space of 50 centimeter to 1 meter between the tree. So initial growing space per seedling 1 square meter. So each sapling got, say, 1 square meter growing space minimum. And then he used acorn for sowing, and he also used trees for planting, So it was sowing and planting both he practiced. And he came up with this idea that around 100 to 150 such groups can be, installed per hectare after the clear felling, so that you have a patch of oak forest coming in surrounded by also Sitka spruce. So some sort of continuous cover forestry idea that was very much promoted by Forestry Commission in 20th century from early on. Yeah. So these was the two different reasons. One, mostly forest conversion. So you may know that Great Britain had only 5% of forest left in 1911. So when Forestry Commission was established in 1916, there was only 5% of Great Britain land was under forest. So they have to reforest a lot, and they did it with Sitka spruce. But they already see the problem of Sitka spruce with invasive species and so on, and diseases. So they wanted to bring back the oak, which is a natural species of UK also. So that's why the idea of nest planting, which is little bit, the reason was a little bit different in Russia, but the two planting was similar. And I kind of the one who tried to sell it as a cluster planting of these two different technique. And in my PhD, I try to compare how this quality of very young trees in terms of silvicultural attribute like straightness of stem and crown shape, branch free bole length, future crop tree ratio, how quality and growth, so DBH growth and height growth changes between traditional planting, which is a row planting. So in the past you have 1 by 1 meter space in row planting, so 10,000 seedling per hectare was planted in the past, and nowadays 4,000 to 5,000 seedlings can be planted. the reasons were different, but after the Cold War, the price of planting material and the labor cost significantly increased in Europe. So nowadays, can you imagine to plant, say, 4,000 oak trees per hectare? In Karlsruhe, we pay 35,000 euro per hectare. We spend 35,000 to 40,000 euro per hectare with browsing protection. And this cost was already increasing since 1990s. So cluster planting use only 1/3 of the land or 1/3 of planting area, and you plant only, say, 1/3 of the seedling, and your expectation is the future crop tree number will be the same and the biomass will be the same, because you expect that there should be a natural regeneration between the groups. But also you hypothesize that those natural regeneration will not create a competition pressure and kill your crop tree. So that was my PhD topic, that how was the competition between natural regeneration and planted crop trees? What was the comparison of growth, and what was the comparison of mortality and other silvicultural attributes? Yes.
Somidh, just so I get this straight, on the nest plantings, as they were doing in Russia, those were, you said, from seed, and they were very, very high density within those clusters. And then in Scotland, were those seedlings that they were planting on 1 square meter each?
They were doing both.
Both.
So in the so Emil Anderson did tried with both aspects. So he planted in one hole around 4 to 5 acorns, yes, and made a distance of around 80 centimeter to 1 meter between the hole, and he also planted. So whether we should plant or whether we should sow, this depends on 2 factors. So the germination rate, I think you know already that only 2% of total acorns survive in nature to reach a sapling stage, only 2%. That is very fascinating, that this depends on the browsing pressure. If you have a high browsing pressure, then you should plant actually a seedling and sapling, because the roe deer height here, the height of the roe deer and red deers are the main browsers in Europe. So the height of roe deer browsing, so 1 to 1.5 meter, I would say that's the browsing height of the deer. So at the moment, our recommendation is at least plant seedlings which is already in that height. So that would be, then that will increase the survival rate, increase the cost, but reduce the mortality. Yes.
Yeah.
So that was the reason why I see now a gradual switch from sowing to planting. Yes.
That's interesting, because we deal with browse pressure as well.
Yeah.
Do you do protection of the clusters within the plantings, or just the trees themselves in any way?
Tubes. So we have the tubes. Yes. But that's a good question. So now the foresters are planting trees in tubes. But my trials, where I did my PhD on 50 forest stands, so 25 trial pairs, many of them were fenced, like a traditional fencing. So traditional fencing would be a lot of cost, because then you have to fence the whole land. Yeah. So the tubes are nowadays cheaper. Also, there are more nature friendly tubes. So that is the one that was nowadays used. But a major problem of cluster planting is site preparation, because as I mentioned to you, that the increase of cost and forest conversion issues and bringing broadleaf in the monospecific land was one reason. Another reason was the increase of storm in Western Europe. If you see number of stand replacing event in terms of, we call it winter hurricane. This is not exactly hurricane. We should not confuse with tropical hurricane, but we do have a winter thunderstorm, snowstorm, and that makes a huge impact. So that my PhD study sites, many of those sites were actually uprooted by storms in 1991, Vivian and Wipke, and in 1990, another storm called Lothar. So these 3 storms, so in the past in Europe, so 100 years ago, we have storms in every 20 years. But now we are getting a storms, say in every 5 to 6 years, a stand replacing storm. It means if you, as I mentioned early on, that we have spruce, pine, beech, oak forest, so very few species. And when suddenly the whole forest fell over because of storm, then you have a lot of debris. And imagine how much money you need to do a complete 100% site preparation, that you take all the debris out, you do all the salvaging and plowing, and then you are planting a rows of 2 by 1 meter. So site preparation cost was extremely high for traditional row planting. After the storm event, it was cheaper to bring people and small handheld machineries compared to large scale machineries, and marking the area in the forest where you will only do your groups, set aside or do not do anything with the debris that are there. So it means when you think about the ecological point of view, I think a lot of research was done in USA and Canada about legacies from the old forest. So those legacies from the old forest then remain in the system, but we do have a new planting. So you can call it cluster planting, group and nest planting, a sort of mixed restoration. So it is a kind of mixed restoration because it combines active restoration. So we are really planting trees, but in less number, in clump or in cluster. And we are also doing some sort of passive restoration because we are allowing the old structure to stay in the forest and also allowing natural regeneration between the clusters. So you can say that group planting is a sort of mixed restoration.
That's really fascinating, Greg. I think that we've talked a lot about ecological forestry and some of those adapting old tools to be used for new purposes. And this feels like, even though it was developed for other purposes, it's a really nice fit for maybe some of the things we're doing, like you talked about preserving legacies in the forest, but maybe even thinking about something like assisted migration, where you're not necessarily trying to replant a whole site. You're just trying to maybe bring genetics or maybe a species for the future in that site. It feels like it's a good fit for ecological forestry too.
Yeah, I think that is the one reason why after my PhD, I felt that cluster planting become very popular here, because we have proven with our data, with long-term data, that it works silviculturally and ecologically in not everywhere, but in certain conditions, certain sites it work. And now you can see, at least I know 4 states like Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Rhineland-Palatinate, Hessen, and recently also in Brandenburg, I saw that cluster planting becoming a more common way of tree planting, because it saves the cost and it also somehow bring back ecological diversity from the early on. But that is a very interesting question, by the way. What kind of silviculture we do in Germany? So that's a very, very broad, but there is a very famous German term called Femmelschlag, which can kind of creating small gap in the forest, in the north-south direction, oval shape, so that you have a sun availability throughout the day, and you plant your desired species there. So imagine that you have a monoculture and then you want to bring some broadleaf and you do the Femmelschlag. But when you do the Femmelschlag, you don't plant a tree that you don't want, right? So you will only plant an oak tree or beech tree or tree with a value. But what about Betula pendula, birch or aspen, Poplar tremuloides or salix? So early successional vegetation. So a major problem of close to nature forestry and Femmelschlag system and selection with shelterwood system is that we somehow miss the light demanding tree species in the landscape, because light demanding tree species, fast growing, light demanding and not so high value tree species like poplar, birch, they were not so much wanted in terms of silvicultural point of view, because they create a competition to your target tree species like oak and beech. However, this spatial separation of high value tree species and a low value species can become useful to bring back those early successional vegetation. And I somehow put that in my thesis, that when we do disturbance-based silviculture. If you say that disturbance is not only a risk, but also an opportunity for us to restore the forest. So if you go for a disturbance-based silviculture, or in US, in Washington, Oregon, I saw those famous examples of disturbance-based silviculture. So if you go for disturbance-based silviculture, then we need to bring back early successional vegetation as well.
Mhm.
Without early successional vegetation, you actually miss a whole series of biodiversity in the first 20 to 30 years after the disturbance. So I think cluster planting gives us that opportunity,
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the SilviCast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show.
You talked about, and what you studied in your PhD was cluster planting with oak, but does this technique work for other species, or can those clusters be mixed species? How does that look?
So at the moment, it's very much with oak still. The reason is we do not have good quality data to compare whether it works with other tree species. I did only one publication with Prunus avium, so cherry trees, and it worked in the cherry trees, but it was a case study. I can't say that it will work everywhere because I don't have replicates all over the landscape. It's only few stands in area. I think since last 5 to 10 years, foresters are nowadays thinking cluster planting also for forest restoration purpose, not only for silviculture. So when I did my PhD, one major aspect of cluster planting was high value timber production still. As I said, that 70% of Germany's trees, so Germany has around 90 billion trees. So out of 90 billion trees, 70% are in German language, krank or unhealthy. It means that we have to put restoration a big focus now, in addition to commercial forestry. Commercial forestry shall continue, of course, but we need to put also money and resources and time to restore the growing stock, to maintain a healthy growing stock. And for that, we should plant cluster planting with different tree species. The problem here is that which tree species we should plant and why. Oak is a tree species which is problematic to grow. Why? Because it is getting outcompeted and it has a lot of diseases and so on. So oak is always difficult to grow, and we had a good experience with oak. Other tree species, for example, they can be still grown through natural regeneration. So there is a trade-off that whether we should do cluster planting or we promote natural regeneration. So for example, Fagus sylvatica, oak, these are the two high-value broadleaves in Germany. We do have other tree species, other broadleaves, but they are not so high value. And cluster planting for coniferous trees could be a very, very good option, but we have not so much trial here. Why? Because there is a big decline among the new foresters and the current foresters to promote more conifers. Because if you see Germany's site map, you will see that a large amount of Germany's land is actually not suitable for conifer. Conifer was planted to compensate the timber loss of First World War, Second World War. So conifer was promoted because we need timber very fast. And that was the reason we have conifer everywhere. Conifer many thousand years ago. So when Julius Caesar first came to send the first army to Alemania, that is the Latin name, that time when they were passing through this region, which I see the hill there, is called Black Forest. It was called Black Forest because the forest was so dark, and the tree which was not allowing sun to penetrate was Fagus sylvatica. So it was the old growth forest of Germany was broadleaf forest in most of the cases, not everywhere, but almost in a high landscape. So as under climate change adaptation strategy, there is a decline of conifer planting and recommendation of conifer planting and more for the broadleaf and even assisted migration. So bringing other broadleaves from Southern Europe or even from outside Europe, from USA or from Asia. But the conifer that is still being planted is actually Pinus sylvestris or Scots pine and Douglas fir from USA. These two species are somehow tolerated to drought, but I can tell you that I have not seen a successful example of here. So I think we should try that. But in Scotland, Emil Anderson also planted Sitka spruce in cluster.
Yeah.
And I visited some of those area, and it was successful. It was 100 years ago he did that. And I saw a stand near Edinburgh, I think in 2014. And you cannot see anymore the cluster, but you can see that there is a forest stand. Yes.
Yeah, Brad and I have talked about that this could have applications in a number of different species, and one of them was introduction of conifers into, we have the opposite situation where we
Right.
have lots of hardwood. The conifer was cut out. We no longer have the seed source. And so introducing conifer clusters into that to create a mixed wood sort of situation is something that might have application here.
I think you should think about the initial growing space. So for oak, initial growing space which I found is 1 square meter. Do you know about the Nelder wheel trials? So that is quite famous in Europe, the Nelder wheels. So in the Nelder wheel trial, we investigated the initial growing space. Yes. So for oak, Quercus robur and Quercus pitrea, 1 square meter is good. Why? Because we want to have a height growth first and less stem growth, because oaks are light demanding but slow growing species. So as a result, we should promote the height growth so that they actually reach a good height so that they get the light. So the trees get lanky. And then after 20 years, we do the first early removal of the competitor so that the thickening stage happens. And also for oak, it is important that we do the self pruning. We promote the self pruning. It means if you plant them in high density, you have two things. You have the height growth that you want, and you have a nice branch free bole length, which is very important for venial log production and also for wine barrel production later on. Yeah.
Mhm.
So if you plant conifers in cluster, then you should think why you want to do that. So for example, if your management goal is reducing cost, so say, for example, I want to plant 50 conifer cluster in 1 hectare just to bring conifer in the landscape, and think if you have a good survivability, so say 70 to 80%, then you do have a mixed forest. And that was the exact reason why the German foresters are nowadays also very interested to have cluster planting, not thinking about silvicultural trade, but only for bringing species back to the landscape after the restoration, and also to have some sort of good composition. So I think then it will work. But if I don't know, for example, if you select some conifer that actually retain the branches, but you want to have somehow self pruning. So if you say, I want to promote self pruning in that conifer species, and then cluster planting will be a super good idea. But then the question is, how much initial growing space is needed? If you need 1 square meter growing space, then you know how many trees you should plant per cluster. So how many trees should be planted per cluster? That question should be answered through Nelder wheel experiment. Because Nelder wheel experiment was fascinating, because that told us that we have in the x-axis growing space and in the y-axis height growth. So we can see that after certain increase of growing space, the curve get flattened. And then you see that could be the optimal growing space, So if you know the optimal growing space of your tree species, and if you know whether you want to keep, height growth and length and straight structure with self pruning, then it can be an option. And if you also have a budget issues, like you want to bring back the conifer in the landscape with low budget, then it can be also a good option.
Greg, this reminds me of some of our northern foresters doing aspen diversification by planting white pine and things like that. And it makes sense what you're saying, that we probably need to base that distance between trees in a cluster on the Silvix of that species.
Yes.
And we will put a link to Nedler wheel descriptions and maybe some research done with that here. I'm curious, are there tricks? So I'm imagining a lot of foresters, this might wet their whistle. They go, man, I want to try this. Is there something they should keep in mind as far as like administration, like tricks to putting this on the ground or getting it set, or anything that would be of use to them for that?
Yeah, I think a very important question would be that what are the co-occurring tree species? So, for example, if they have a high competition from other broadleaves and so on, and if there are species like aspen or willow or birch, which will outcompete the height and then kill the cluster, I would then suggest that to keep a large cluster, so for example, around 30 to 40 seedlings per cluster and in a circular way. And in the periphery of the cluster, I would suggest to plant a tree I call it as a trainer tree. But what trainer tree species could be useful, that also we need to know a little bit the Silvix of that tree species. For us, it was very good Tilia cordata and Fagus sylvatica and Carpinus betulus, because these three species, broadleaf, they don't give too much competition to oak if you can separate their distances around 1 to 2 meters in the first 20 years of life.
Mm-hmm.
And they can actually prevent your oaks from the advancing regeneration, which is coming from other naturally co-occurring tree species. In a very, very fertile site, if you have a fertile site where you have very high growth rate, then it may happen that your trainer tree species itself become a competitor of your target oak tree. And then you need to pollard. So we call Kopfschneiden auf Deutsch. So it's a pollarding. So you should do the pollarding, cut the top of your trainer tree species so that they still provide this function. So I think it could be good for private owners if they try to see that, try to experiment a little bit. I think it would be nice to do some silvicultural experiment before we recommend,
Right.
because
So as Brad said, I think we will have foresters here who want to give this a try. So I still have just a few logistical questions around, say, doing this with oak. What are some of the current best practices in Germany for doing this with oak? So how many clusters do people usually put in? You said about a third of the stand. Is that still about?
When I started my PhD, that was the condition, that around 1/3 of the land area should be covered by the cluster.
Okay.
So it means if a cluster is around, say, 40 square meter in size, then 1/3 of a hectare is, say, 3,300 square meter. So you have around, say, 80 to 100 clusters per hectare. So that was some sort of standard. But nowadays, the foresters are reducing further it. So it depends on the site. If you have a site where you have high regeneration naturally coming from the other tree species, and if the owners are interested to also keep those natural regeneration, then my suggestion would be 50 cluster per hectare. That should suffice you to get your target tree species.
Mm-hmm.
And also the size of the cluster should be around, say, 30 to 40 square meter, and initial growing space at least 1 meter. But as I say, the Silvix will decide what should be the initial growing space. So we need a more assessment before we say that. So the best practice nowadays is, I can say 50 to 60 clusters are planted like groups. So I'm talking about now group planting. Nest planting is somehow abundant here because of extremely high mortality due to intraspecific competition. So as you know, in nest planting, trees were planted very, very dense. So there was high mortality. So group planting, the success was quite good. So 70% of a tree survived after 20 years. So therefore, group planting is becoming more common here. So 50 to 60 groups per hectare is one good practice. Another good practice is the quality of seedling. So we are planting now, as I say, around 1,5 meter. So that's quite tall. So and it cost €5 to €6 per seedling. In our area, they should plant a tree which is above the browsing height of the local browsing animal. So that is one good practice. And another good practice is that a kind of regular tending, and that is something what is missing in the literature. What happens about the follow-up tending and thinning operation, and how that influence the overall economy of the cluster planting? And that is the part which is still missing. So that was the reason what I was telling you, that I wrote an email to Forest Service that we should now reactivate our research in this topic. Yeah. So particularly looking about the cost, that how much was the tending cost. So after they plant the cluster, they should create a central pole. So they should make a central pole inside the cluster. So they know that is the center part of the cluster, because I found that the future crop tree, at least for the oak, the probability was 50% higher to get a future crop tree inside the center part of the cluster. And it means for oak trees, intra-specific competition is enough for qualification for high quality compared to inter-specific competition. And this was very hard for me to publish, because normally we thought that interspecific competition is actually good for qualification, but it's not always true for oak. And then I asked myself whether we should plant those trainer trees at all, or whether we should just plant another round of oak tree.
Yeah.
But then later on, I realized trainer trees, basically the main function of trainer trees is actually a protection function. It means when deer and other animals, they try to browse in the area, they go for the outermost trees. And if those are the trainer trees, then they protect from, they just work like a fence, you know.
And those trainer trees, that's just that outer perimeter of trees you're talking about.
Yes.
And you're choosing those based on the silvical characteristics, so that they go well with the competition and they don't outcompete the oak in the center.
We call it trainer trees. So in the forestry, we have two types of trees, nurse trees and trainer trees. So the trainer trees actually help the target trees from below. It train the bole of a tree to make it straight. Yeah.
Yep.
So it means the trainer tree should be always a co-dominant tree. It shall never become a dominant tree. Because the dominant tree should be your target tree. So that's how we call it trainer trees, in comparison to nurse tree, where you have a nurse crop which is actually at the top and helping your target tree, which is at the co-dominant layer. So trainer tree has two functions. So initially, the trainer trees was planted for actually training the bole, and that was what I found. I did not find a trainer tree effect at the outermost part of the circle of group, because in my case, the probability to getting a high quality tree was higher inside the circle as a result of intra-specific competition. So then why we need a trainer tree? Because trainer tree was supposed to be helping trees to get a good bole. But the oak trees have a genetical tendency that they will throw all their branches to the direction of light. So it means the buds which are on the stem, the buds, there are around 5 to 6 genes which control the bud development in oak. And the moment you have more light in one part of the stem, then you retain that branches. So therefore, trainer trees was not so helpful. But in the area where we have high trainer trees, we have less browsing effect and less mortality also. So therefore, I concluded in my PhD that trainer trees, initially thought for training the stem quality, they do also other job. They actually protect, they do a protection function, and therefore trainer trees should be continued. It should not be abandoned. And another reason is trainer tree is a shade tolerant tree species. So you should plant a shade tolerant tree species as a trainer, because as I said, that your target tree should be always at the top. In my opinion, having trainer trees also increase the diversity. So in case your oak crop fails, then you still have a trainer trees in the forest. Yes.
So right now, it sounds like cluster planting is on this gradient of production, and now we're maybe moving down that gradient toward restoration. So as we get different species besides oak that we're using in clusters. Our trainer trees may change. The arrangement of our clusters in the landscape or in our planting may change. So it's a brand new world for cluster planting once we bring it into this restoration world.
Yes. So the question is, when you do the forest restoration, what is your goal? So if you want to have high quality tree, say how many high quality tree after the end of the felling series or rotation? If we want to have, say, 180 to 100 high quality trees after 100 year, then we still need to think about high quality tree in uniformly distributed area. And in cluster planting, if at least one tree succeeds per cluster, so if you plant 50 trees per cluster, per hectare, then suppose that there are 40 to 50 oak trees remain as a high quality tree after 100 years, but then you are still losing, or you are still in a deficit of 40 to 50 more other high quality trees. So that was why I say you should not only think about oak future crop tree, but non-oak future crop tree. And when it comes to diversity of future crop tree in German forestry, that was very fascinating part, because traditionally we are trained to keep one crop in the forest, because our felling series and our cycle is dependent for one species. So if you want to create 2 or 3 at the dominant layer, then we should have a proper spatial mix. And that was exactly I found, and I wrote in one paper, that if you do the group planting, then at least there is a guarantee that in every 10 to 15 meter, you have one oak tree, which can be a future crop tree. And it means when you do the thinning later on, you are not thinning a high quality tree. You are thinning a tree which is a poor quality, because the qualification for timber production, you are separating in a landscape in a way, you reduce the cutting of high quality trees.
This is going to generate a lot of questions. I hope this is going to generate a lot of questions with our listeners, because it's making, I can see wheels turning.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking about this a lot. And I kind of think about my career and something you said, Brad. We're always seem to be like 1 or 2 steps behind some of the techniques in Germany.
Yeah.
Somidh, we started planting hardwoods heavily in the 80s, and we planted them at 20 feet apart, really wide spacing.
Yeah.
And I remember we had some German foresters visit, and they said, no, much closer, much closer.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, our foresters have learned through experience, oh, we have to plant our hardwoods much closer. And so we've gotten to higher density plantings, similar to some of the rates, maybe not quite as heavy as some of yours. And now, and as Brad said in the beginning, cluster planting, we haven't really applied that. And so our costs are also going up for all of this. And so this is really maybe another opportunity to look at a different technique to get some of the benefits and same results, but at a lower cost.
Yeah.
And as you said, Brad, apply it maybe from an ecological forestry standpoint, a restoration standpoint, on trying to get seed sources into places where they are degraded from the past, lots of different reasons. So yeah, I can definitely see some ideas here.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So what I picture is we've done that. This could be like maybe a form of enrichment planting in some places that we do, where we might be, but we could use it for so many different reasons and as a tool of so many ways. Greg, the whole conversation reminds me of and I think it was Professor Bob Rogers at Stevens Point when I was there. I think he said something along the line of, if you ever think you have a unique idea in forestry, it means you don't know German, because they've already thought about it. They've already worked through this, and you're behind the times. So I think we're still behind the times, but this is fascinating.
No, but I think you see that, as I mentioned at the early on, that it's a philosophy of forestry, intensive versus extensive. So if you think about the roundwood production, US is fine. It's 180 million cubic meters. So US has so much land, and you can actually, profit from natural regeneration, and you can make thousands of square kilometer block. And that's why I say in Germany, it is a very small amount of land, and they are producing a lot of wood out of it. So therefore, all this, as I was telling you, that these are like a micromanagement of every single tree, and this is not possible if you don't have human resources, and so cluster planting or group planting perhaps can be tried in USA somewhere where you have a shortage of resources. You have a demand to fulfill which cannot be fulfilled through natural regeneration, or you have a demand for a specific industry where, for example, you need a certain high quality timber for a specific market, and there I think you need some sort of link with the market and the demand, and I think then it will work. And another case cluster planting will work is forest restoration in general, because then you bring the diversity and so on. So I think we should do some sort of trial if possible, and I will be very happy to somehow support you or join. Yeah.
Hey, we'll have you here.
That's right.
We'll find the land and we'll
Yeah.
do a trial. We already have foresters who are interested. So,
Yeah.
Somidh, I just really thank you for coming and bringing some of these ideas and new techniques for us to try here. So I just really appreciate these conversations.
And thank you very much for having me, and I really appreciate that. And I hope that we could do some further cooperation and do some trial, and I will be really happy if you visit us here and I can show you some of the cluster planting sites.
Hey, Greg, that's what we got to do. We got to put a tour together. SilviCast going to Europe.
Yes. Wow. That would be super.
So if our supervisor Carmen is listening, we'll be putting a travel authorization in.
Yeah. It'll be fun.
Somidh, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Brad, I really appreciate it when we talk about things that are new and give opportunities for people to try new things, at least new for us here in the United States. We haven't done cluster planting, as far as I know, to any large degree.
It really gets the juices flowing when you get new topics, something that maybe we've all done tree planting, we've all done things, but we've probably all done it in a very similar way across probably most of the United States. So this is really going to be interesting. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that this episode generates.
Yeah, and I think tree planting for us has evolved, at least over my career, and this is just another step in that process, another different technique to use, particularly with the increasing costs that Somidh had mentioned was also a problem in Europe. So I just think it has really cool application, and I look forward to people giving it a try.
Yep. I think Frank Sinatra said it, the best is yet to come, Greg. So thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.